Call to order the meeting of the Minnehaha Creek Watershed District Board of Managers, January 11, 2024. All managers are present but for Manager Miller. Members of the public, I don't see anyone, so is there a motion to approve the agenda?
So moved.
Thank you, Manager Maxwell. Is there a second?
Second.
Manager Hedgemati seconds. Those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? On the consent agenda tonight, we have approval of the December 28th board meeting minutes and approval of the check registers. Is this it? For the general checking account, surety checking account, and wire transfers. I didn't remember that. And of resolutions, 24-1, a district funds depository, 24-2, non-cash financial assurances, 24-3, district newspaper, 24-4, pay equity report, and 24-5, boundary adjustment with Lower Minnesota River Watershed District. Is there a motion to approve the consent agenda?
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you, Manager Sandel. Those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? I have a couple of things for my report. One is that just the way the workflow goes, there may be some lighter meetings or even meeting cancellations the first part of the year, as the committee was canceled tonight. So we'll just watch for that, see what happens. Mr. Whisker and I met with Commissioner Fernando yesterday. It was a really good discussion we had with her. She talked a lot about climate. We talked about 325 Lake Road. She had some funding thoughts. And so we left feeling that we had a really good conversation with her. And she's very supportive of our work. The upcoming meetings are shown in the agenda, including Metro Watersheds, where I'll be liaison, and CAC. Manager Maxwell, I believe, will not be in attendance, but...
No, I'll be there for that one.
Oh, okay, sweet.
I won't be here to give the report because I'll be gone that's the week I'll be gone.
I misunderstood you. Okay. Now, Ms. Christopher, we have the public hearing for the proposed rule revisions.
Okay, thank you, President White, managers. Tonight we have the public hearing for the rule revisions. And before we open up for any public comment, I want to just provide a little background. I'll start with the purpose of the rule revisions, the process we've run to develop the rules, a brief summary of the substantive changes, and then the public comment process. And so, as the board knows, this process really originated going back to the 2018 strategic plan that the board adopted, really to align all of our programs with the balanced urban ecology vision. It's really focused on improving integration of land use and water planning, recognizing we can be more effective in achieving our mission if we are working in partnership with those who are making changes on the landscape. And so, knowing that our permitting program is one of the primary ways we interact with the land use community, we ran a process with staff, the CAC, and the board to evaluate the program and identify opportunities for improvement. And we looked at everything from the rules to procedures to IT, compliance framework, and other aspects as well. And so through that process, we identified a set of goals and policy directives, and the goals that were defined specifically for the rules were first to simplify and streamline rule language, submittals and processes to enhance clarity and really improve customer service. Second, to improve efficiency and effectiveness by tailoring our regulations and field presence to the level of natural resource risk. So the goal here really is to streamline process for low-risk activities, both so that, to ensure that the burden on applicants is reasonable, and also so that we're putting our staff time to highest and best use. And then finally, aligning our regulatory scope and standards with other agencies, both for increased consistency and also to ensure that we're compliant in the case of the state MS4 permit. The district is a municipal separate storm sewer system that is required to comply with a state permit and have regulations that are as protective as that permit, and so that's what's driving some of the standards changes. Or really, that's kind of the main area where we have changes to standards. Beyond that, it is really more about improving customer service, streamlining, and clarifying. And so following that process to identify issues, in fall of 2021, the board reviewed the proposed policy direction and approved a scope of work to begin working on the rules. From there, staff worked with legal counsel and engineers to draft specific rule text. And then in 2022, the district created a technical advisory committee made up of representatives from our cities, counties, and other partner agencies to review and vet the rules as part of the broader Land and Water Partnership Initiative. And through that process, we were able to gain valuable perspective of our public partners and some good suggestions to further improve clarity and streamline the rules for low-risk projects. And through those discussions and some surveys that we did, we also found that there was strong support for the direction the district was going with the rules and the improvements that we were making. That process ended in June of '23, and since then we've been making some additional edits to integrate TAC feedback and also just developing additional guidance documents to support the public review process. And in October, that was authorized by the board to initiate that process. And so next I'll provide a brief overview of the main changes proposed. So all 15 rules listed here have been revised to some degree. The 7 outlined in red have more substantive changes that I'll review, and the others, including the administrative rules, have mainly been revised to improve clarity and make some housekeeping updates. So first, the erosion control rule has 2 main areas of change. One is, again, updating it to align with the state MS4 permit as required. And this was done by incorporating the construction stormwater general permit standards by reference. And in doing so, we were able to significantly simplify the rule. And our requirements and process are already very similar to the MS4 permit, so it just makes things a lot more simple and consistent. And second, we proposed a general permit for projects that disturb less than an acre and don't trigger any other rules. And again, this goes back to that desire to essentially align our staff time with areas of risk and streamline those processes that pose lower risk while still and retaining authority and the ability to review those site plans and inspect those sites if needed. For the stormwater management rule, this is the one that has seen the most significant changes. And again, these are driven by the need to align with the MS4 permit. And so some of the changes include essentially overhauling our stormwater treatment tables, which are now greatly simplified and consistent with the state permit in terms of how things are classified as new development or redevelopment, and the treatment scopes that are required for those different categories. We've also updated sequencing requirements for how applicants can move through consideration of abstraction practices, and then if those are not feasible, get to filtration or other practices. And finally, updating our credit schedule, which outlines what practices can receive what level of credit, some of which were out of compliance with the state rules and have been modified. Next is the water body crossings and structures rule. And the main change here is the addition of a fast track option, which would apply for public projects doing routine replacement of culverts, where they have equivalent dimensions and materials. So just trying to create a more streamlined process there, knowing that there's minimal risk with no real change in the type of pipe that's being put in. Next, for wetland protection, the main changes here are related to the buffer provisions and are intended to provide additional flexibility for public agencies, for projects that have equivalent protection. For instance, where there's public land that already has protections in place, we're trying to provide flexibility on signage, maintenance declarations, those types of things. There's also some changes to provide flexibility for maintenance for right-of-way projects for safety reasons, as well as some flexibility for projects where the buffer requirements may conflict with a water-dependent recreational or educational goals. Next for shoreline and stream bank, fairly minor change here, which is really just looking at how we calculate the stabilization method that's required, and it's including velocity calculations in that equation essentially. And these are information that's already required to be submitted. It's just changing kind of how we factor that into the calculation. Next for dredging, main changes here are again creating a general permit track for low-risk projects. In this case, for public agencies that are removing non-native sediment at an outfall, knowing that there's, again, this is kind of routine maintenance activities, limited scope, that by a public agency we view that as low risk. They want to create a more streamlined process. And then in addition, we're proposing a fast track option for repeat navigational dredging. Again, this is looking at something that we've already permitted in the past, already have materials on file, trying to create a more streamlined process there as well. And finally, for the variance and exceptions rule, based on advice from legal counsel, we're proposing to replace the undue hardship standard with a practical difficulty standard to better align with city and county land use statutes. And so going back to process, under statute we're required to distribute the rules for 45-day comment period. This went out on December 18th and is set to close on February 1st. The rules and the public hearing have been noticed in the Star Tribune as well as the district website, and then also sent directly to all the public transportation authorities, including MnDOT, cities, counties, and townships. We've also sent it to all of our state agencies, TAC members, major contractor and engineering firms, and frequent applicants. And we've created a dedicated web page, which you can see there on the right, that includes current and proposed rules, a detailed guidance document that outlines the purpose and scope of revisions, the process, and the rationale for all substantive changes. And then finally, we're prepared side-by-sides because of the amount of changes and reorganization of the rules. It was not really feasible to produce red lines, so instead we've done side-by-sides for easier comparison. To date, no comments have been received, but we'll expect more of those to come in the coming weeks. And following the close of the comment period, we will, of course, carefully consider all comments, develop responses, and come back to the board with any recommended changes before requesting adoption. And with that, I will turn it back to President White.
Thank you very much, Ms. Christopher. Have we received any public comment to this date?
We have not.
Okay. Close the public hearing. The next business item is election of board officers and appointment of committee assignments. And as you know, election can be done by nomination or motion. And we'll begin with the office of president.
I nominate Sherry White.
Thank you. Is there a second?
Second.
Discussion?
Oh, you can't second it. Well, I'll make a third.
Those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Thank you very much. Office of vice president.
I'll nominate Bill.
Thank you. Manager Maxwell, is there a second? Thank you. Manager Hijmati. Those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Office of treasurer.
I'll nominate Jessica.
Thank you, Manager Maxwell. Second by Manager Sando. Those in favor say aye.
Aye.
And office of secretary. We don't need you to make this motion.
I'll move Manager Maxwell.
Great. Is there a second?
Second.
Manager Loftus, second. Those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Thank you, one and all. Committees. We will keep the committees as before. This is, of course, subject to your approval. So OPC would be Manager Loftus, Chair, Manager Olson, Manager Hijmati, and Policy and Planning would be Dick Miller, Chair, Manager Maxwell, Manager Sando. Is there a motion to approve those committee appointments?
So moved.
Thank you, Manager Olson.
Second.
Manager Hejmani seconds. Those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Item 11.2, Ms. Sweet has Resolution 24006.
All right, President White, Board of Managers, I'm pleased to be in front of you tonight to request authorization to execute a contract with the University of Minnesota to evaluate the effectiveness of CART management as a watershed management strategy. So tonight I'll give you a quick reminder of the current status and goals regarding our CART management in 6 Mile now that we've closed the grant and we've moved into a new phase. This is going to include an effectiveness assessment, which will be in partnership with the MPCA and the DNR. And then ultimately, I'll go over the resolution that's before you tonight to contract with U of M to conduct the assessment. So here's our current status in 6 Mile, the kind of familiar maps that you've seen a few times. We've made a serious dent in reducing CARP since we began in 2016. You'll remember I was before you in early December with a CARP removal contract. And that's to tackle one of our current goals of continuing to reach and maintain the CARP biomass thresholds in 6 Mile. But tonight I'm going to be talking a little bit more about, now that we've met the threshold on the majority of these lakes, we want to assess the water quality and vegetation response that we're seeing and communicate MCW's CARP story. So to assess the response, we have already begun looking at the data. We presented some of the preliminary findings back in June. But what we're immediately seeing is that across the 13 lakes in 6 Mile, there's kind of a variety of responses. Some lakes, like Wasserman on the left, we are seeing vegetation improve now that we've removed CARP. But there's others like East Auburn that aren't showing much of a response. This, of course, has us thinking, why? What is driving the difference in lake response after CARP management? Definitely a very important question. As we move into new geographies, we'll want to know when and where it makes sense to do CARP management going forward. So to answer these questions, we want to dig deeper into our data, but we know we're not alone in asking this question, and it's pertinent to many others that are doing CARP management in the state. So in the fall of last year, we began networking with our partners, and after a few conversations, really found a lot of overlap between us, the MPCA, and the DNR. We had heard from the MPCA that they were actually in the process of beginning their own study to analyze the effectiveness of in-lake management tactics on water quality. And then the DNR, they're the regulatory agency for CARP management permits, and they would like more guidance and rationale for when and where they should be approving or denying permits. So in November, we signed and developed an MOU with these partners to outline our mutual interests and collaborate on a larger scale effectiveness assessment that will look at CARP management across the state. So we budgeted $75,000 for this work to be completed. Our partners have already helped us in kind of setting direction for the project, and they've agreed to provide feedback along the way, help acquire the necessary data sets, and then endorse the final report at the end if it meets their approval. So to do this analysis, we know we're kind of looking for researchers with a somewhat specific area of expertise. We discussed with our partners some of the concerns and desires for what kind of researchers we're looking for, and that led us to MACERC, the AIS Research Center at the U, and they were the ones that conducted the initial CARP assessment. So through them, we got in touch with Dan Larkin, who is an applied aquatic plant researcher in MACERC, and his background and previous work really makes him extremely qualified. We've been tracking his work and his grad students' work over the years, and there's some very pertinent research, including some work on native aquatic plant restoration. Another kind of interesting thing about his kind of group of researchers is that they've developed an aquatic plant database, a statewide database, that kind of all the surveys that are collected by various agencies across the state are aggregated into. This is something that's already exists for water quality and other things, but is kind of brand new for aquatic plants, just developed in the last 2 years. So it's very valuable and just a resource that's just kind of waiting to be tapped for a question like this. So Dan and his postdoc were very interested. They put together a proposal to conduct this analysis, which we've had our partners review, and I'll go over for you now. So their scope's timeline is fairly straightforward, and it's broken out into quarterly tasks over this year. In the first quarter, they're going to be focused on data compilation. Their proposal consists of a multi-scale study that's going to look at our data in 6 Mile, and then as many additional lakes across Minnesota that have the correct data available that we can include. Then they'll move into the data analysis phase, looking at the 3 main variables of carp, water quality, and vegetation, as well as many of the other co-variables that could be causing the differing response, like lake morphology, pre-existing water quality conditions. There's kind of a whole long list of things that they'll be including. So in quarter 3, they'll have preliminary findings, which our partners will have a chance to dig into and provide feedback that will then help shape the final report. And the plan there is to have that report developed in a scientific journal with us listed as co-authors, and that will also be presented at relevant conferences, so we can communicate our results to the broader community. So this contract has been laid out with a total not to exceed of just under $65,000, with it spread across the 4 different tasks as kind of breakpoints. We'll also be meeting with the team and the researchers monthly to provide course corrections along the way and make sure things are according to plan. But with that, I'd like to request authorization to execute a contract with the University of Minnesota to evaluate the effectiveness of carp management for an amount not to exceed $64,947.48. You may note that we did not go competitive for this proposal due to our view of the U of M's position as leaders in the state doing this type of AIS research, and their mission is to develop research-based solutions. Truly makes them uniquely qualified to complete this work. But with that, I'd like to welcome any questions you may have.
Thank you, Ms. Sweet. Is there a motion to adopt the resolution? Manager Hijmati, is there a second?
Second.
Manager Olson. Any questions for Ms. Sweet? Manager Hijmati.
Yes. As you know, as they are compiling the data and beginning the analysis, they'll probably find some holes in the data. So say, gee, I wish we could measure this, we can measure that. Is there a plan to be able to do some of that at some point?
Manager Hijmati, yes, I think we're going to be fairly flexible and open to collecting as many available data sets as we can. And if there's something that jumps out as, hey, we're missing this, I think we'll definitely be able to be flexible and include that.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Hopefully the DNR, the MPCA can also help with some of that.
Yeah.
Not just us, because we're going across the state. It's spreading us very thin if we go across the state.
Yeah.
So there would be some of that. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, the data collection, we're lucky the water quality and the vegetation should be fairly straightforward due to that already being statewide databases. The carp component will be a little trickier, getting the carp population estimates and management actions, but we have a lot of contacts and resources to acquire that. But
Okay.
that will be the one that takes a little bit more effort.
Okay, in the water quality, I'm sure there's been data taken over time. The vegetation, has there really been data taken over time, or is it just like the last couple of years, or what's the quality of that data in terms of temporal quality of the data?
Yeah, manager, great question. So that's one reason why they're looking at this in sort of a multi-scale fashion, because we kind of are assuming that our data set is going to be the most robust. We've been really targeting all of the effectiveness. We had that plan in mind from the very beginning, so we've done a lot of the plant surveys and water quality.
Yes.
But when we expand outward, it will become kind of more tricky, I think, to make sure we have that same level of robustness. So it's kind of including it where we can. But yeah, the plant surveys aren't as frequent, maybe as have been accomplished in our 6 Mile lakes.
That's what I was thinking. Okay.
Hopefully we'll be able to get enough.
Yeah. Go ahead. Someone.
Is this all research or is it removal during this period of time?
Manager Sando, yeah, so all of this will be looking at data that's already been collected and removal efforts that have already taken place. So it's simply looking at things that have already been collected.
Data.
We'll of course be doing additional data collection on our own going forward that may eventually be included, but it's all previously collected work.
Manager Olson?
Not related. Where are our boats?
Our manager also, so our boats are stored over at the Minnehaha Public Works. Yeah, they have a gate in the area that we are able to store them, but I get them winterized at shrink wrapped and they're tucked in nice over there at the Public
Okay,
Works.
so they're both winterized?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, and they're outside?
Shrink wrap.
Okay, okay.
Yeah, we have a handful of different boats. We have a shock boat and everything gets,
How many?
we have 4 boats. Minnetonka, upper sampling, and then I guess the shock boat, and then just like a smaller John boat for getting into lakes that don't have a public access.
Thank you for that refresher.
Manager Maxwell?
Well, I know we're working with the DNR, but the other water districts, do they go out and hire a school to do their cart management too? And do they share that data with us and after they get it? I realize there's a difference, but is it, some lakes are, how we can compare lake to lake?
Yeah, Manager Maxwell, so that's what we're gonna be helping you with, is collecting that data, because we are aware of sort of the different watersheds and agencies that are doing CARP work. So we'll be helping them reach out to those agencies to collect their stuff. One thing is that a lot of watersheds hire out consultants to do that type of work. And there's pretty limited consultants that are able to do that. So that's one thing we're going to be looking at, is reaching out to the 2 consulting firms, as that might be a quicker way to access kind of that data. They'll already have all that compiled.
Any other questions? All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Thank you very much, Ms. Sweet.
Thank you.
And thank you, Mr. Beck, for flagging this as something that was well worth looking into going forward. Are there board inquiries, issues, or ideas to bring forward tonight?
Just mention that.
Oh, just a reminder to everyone that they need to make their campaign finance disclosure by the 29th of January. Something I wanted to mention is, as we go through 2024, looking at the 2025 budget, I would be interested in getting some numbers and ideas about mitigation efforts that we might make, what they would cost and entail, and whether they're worth going forward. You know, solar panels or electric charging stations for cars, or I mean, there's all kinds of things we might want to do. Mr. Whisker.
President White, managers, I believe in the climate action framework, one of the action steps is some level of operational or energy audit of kind of our current facilities and fleet and those sorts of things. So I can talk to Becky and we can figure out where that might slot in this year and if that's going to be done in time to inform the budget in any kind of strategic way.
Okay, thank you. I hadn't remembered that. The next item is an update on the American Geophysical Union Conference. Mr. Beck.
President White, Board of Managers. What I have before you today was a request from the board at a previous meeting to present our learnings from the American Geophysical Union conference that I got to, along with Becky Christopher, James Whisker, and Alex Steele, and bring that back and just give a little bit more information and a little bit more detail about some of the things we learned. So, just as an overview, I thought what we could talk about was, why we attended the American Geophysical Union, which is a primarily, hard science conference with a cross-section of different departments, what we learned and how we think what we learned will be used with the projects that we're doing right now. So why did we attend? If you rewind back to 2018 and the Strategic Action Plan, one of the most important things that we learned was integrating the different departments and different teams on projects was really important to ensure that we're bringing all the expertise together instead of having projects siloed with different departments. In 2020, MCWD started the climate work that we are working on today, And that was one of the more cross-departmental projects that were, or initiatives that were moving forward. In 2022, R&M had attended the AGU conference, and one of the things we noticed was outside of the climate science and watershed science, there was a lot of policy and outreach talks that intersected with the scientific talks. So we thought in 2023, we'd assemble a team, cross-departmental team that is supporting the climate work to go and bring back that information to help us implement and develop the climate action framework further. So there was 3 general topics that I think fit nicely along with the climate action framework, which is what I'll be talking about, what we learned today at the conference, which fall into 3 categories, which are watershed science and climate tools, which are kind of the bread and butter of the things that they presented there. But in addition to that was integrating the policy and science together and how they have quantitative frameworks for incorporating outreach into different aspects of scientific work. So the first thing that we learned in this first theme was about, we learned a lot about global climate change models. And one of the first things that we hear a lot about is downscaling models. And what does that mean? It's taking a model that has a fairly coarse resolution for climate scenario analysis, which the resolution is something like the size of the state of Minnesota, and bringing it down to a resolution that is actually useful for us, to the kind of tens of miles squared instead of 50,000 miles squared, which isn't as useful. So the worry, I think, was that, are these models going to have precipitation data for the future that are useful? And the answer is yes. There's a lot of organizations that are taking those global or general circulation models and downscaling them to regional size, and then they're going further in that a lot of groups are taking that information and putting it into local hydrologic models. This isn't new, a lot of other people are doing it, so we're not so far out in front that nobody else is doing this. This is a very common practice, and the data is there for us to use. And interestingly, when we went to the Midwest Climate Conference recently, the U of M had many presentations on, hey, please use our downscaled climate models for your hydrologic models. So it's kind of perfect, and it's not something that is bleeding edge. It's a commonplace thing that universities are doing now. And to further drive home that point, this is another example of a presentation of somebody that's created a very specific framework on how to do this. Take those GCM models, run them many times, downscale them, and use that to put into flood model validation. So I probably could give 10 more of these examples of presentations. So it's something that's very commonly done, and I think we're not going to have a barrier for this kind of technical barrier, which was a worry at first. In addition, obviously it's important to understand how that increased precipitation is going to impact Minnehaha Creek. So this is the hydrograph of Minnehaha Creek at near the outlet, which is measured by the USGS. And when you look at it, you can look at a couple different ways, which includes, like I highlighted, for example, different periods for our creek, which are wet periods, which are in blue, orange periods that are in dry, orange periods, which are the dry periods. And what I wanted to do was look beyond just the noise and say, what if we take a 1-inch event during the wet period, after the 7 wettest years on record, and compare it to a 1-inch event during the dry period. And that 1-inch event in 2023, one of the drier periods we've had, looks like this, which without context doesn't mean much, but if you look at a 1-inch event after the 7 wettest years on record, you get 2.5 foot higher water level. And so that's a really big deal, because you can imagine that if we had the 2014 flood of record, which actually happened after a very dry period, in 2019, it would have been even worse than it was than in 2014. So things can be quite bad, and that's primarily due to those long duration, year after year wet periods that cause the really bad floods. And what we learned, that was all a lead up to a concept that somebody else has figured out, even though we don't have a word for it in the Midwest, which is compound flooding. And what that means is, on the coast, what they have is, as water levels rise in the sea from climate change, that's increasing the groundwater levels on the landscape. And the term compound flooding is each individual event, so like a little bit higher groundwater table, or one event, isn't going to cause flooding necessarily, but when you have all these things happen together, a seemingly insignificant rainfall can result in actually pretty bad flooding. And so they're on the coast actually using this information and developing frameworks for what they call compound flooding. And this has been a concept that we've been trying to articulate to cities and other folks around here, and it's been something that we haven't been able to put our finger on exactly how to describe it, but we found out somebody else already did, and actually there was many talks and sessions just about this topic. And we experienced this as an organization in the Nokomis area, right? And actually most areas from 2014 to 2019. And this figure feels pretty familiar to the last one I just showed, which was groundwater tables over 7 years of back-to-back precipitation record conditions raised the groundwater, and what happened was it was flooding in areas that it hadn't before. Smaller events were causing flooding, and we were hearing about it from different residents. And so this concept that seems foreign to us is actually something that has been well studied, and we can use other folks' research to help inform how we talk about compound flooding.
Great slide.
And lastly, not just understanding the severity of how bad floods can be, we also need to understand how to mitigate or adapt our landscape to ensure that we can adapt to climate change. And researchers are asking very specific questions that we're asking, which are, how is wetland loss going to exacerbate the impact of climate change? And what they did was took downscale climate models, put them in a hydrologic model, and then ran different land use scenarios to look at if you have a flood resilient scenario, if you have eco-friendly wetland scenario, if you have a business focused scenario, what would that look like? And what they said was, I just took the conclusion was, losing wetlands will exacerbate flooding in the future, even worse than it already is going to be. So those wetlands are going to be really important. More than anything, storage is going to be really important to ensure that we have on our landscape as we get more and more rainfall. And figuring out exactly how many wetlands we're going to need is going to be something important, so that other people are thinking about this as well. So what we learned, kind of putting this all together, there's a lot of presentations and tried to take the important ones, was that, number one, getting input for our hydrologic models for future precipitation is something very commonplace, and the U of M is going to be a great source for that data. Compound flooding is a concept that is going to be really important, and maybe even as important as our traditional 100-year flood event scenarios that we're used to thinking about, but this compound flooding concept is going to be really important as we get wetter and wetter periods. And lastly, we can't just understand how bad it's going to be, we're going to have to think about how we adapt. And climate adaptation assessments to figure out where to add or retain storage on our landscape is critically important, and folks are thinking about this, and that's really the bread and butter of what we do. Run scenarios and figure out how to add storage to our landscape. So that's the first theme, and we only have two more to go through, and then I'll pause for questions at the end. That really brings us to our ability to take that science and integrate it with policy, because science by itself isn't all that useful until you figure out how to make it actionable. And what we found out was that for taking science and integrating it with policy, there's frameworks that folks have built at the national scale and they literally have handbooks on how to implement these things. And so what they've done was have given outlines on how to take climate vulnerability mapping and understand how hydrologic output can be overlaid with vulnerability and exposure to flooding. And even kind of going one step further than that, they've added nuance of what exposure to a flood is compared to what vulnerability to a flood is. And that took me a second to soak it. Let's soak that in. And what that means is just being exposed to a flood, so average annual precipitation. If you're in an area that floods often, that's one thing. But two areas could have the same exposure to a flood, but have different sensitivities and vulnerabilities, and that household wealth could be something that you could overlay with exposure. And the ability for residents to respond to that is not the same in different areas. So taking all these different factors and using them to help us figure out how to develop policy, implement projects is going to be really important. And they go further of taking all of these different factors and putting them into a quantitative framework. So you can take the layers, overlay them with our hydrologic output, which is has our future climate predictions to drive it, and figure out exactly how exposure sensitivity and adaptive capacity really can inform how we develop policy in a quantitative manner. And so these things have been well developed, and if you put that all together and step back, there's other presentations that if you look back at our climate adaptation framework, which is understand and predict, convene and plan, and implement, other frameworks sound really similar, which is really useful that the U.S. Climate Resilience Toolkit mirrors ours, even though it was developed independently. So I think we're on the right track based on the toolkits that are available to us nationally. And so what did we learn from this was that playbooks exist for integrating watershed assessments and climate adaptation, and that the projects and policies that we want to implement have a lot more nuance than just where is it flooding more and trying to adapt to that. It's layering on the people aspect of it. And lastly, the things that we're implementing and trying to build into our framework really aligns well with other adaptation frameworks, and we're not kind of way out there in left field doing our own thing. So if we have the science and we're developing the policy, the other thing that we need to figure out how to do is have that information reach the public and our partners. And so the last portion that we really enjoyed from this conference was just that outreach frameworks that were being developed. And as I mentioned, these antecedent conditions, so these very wet conditions that are causing exacerbated flooding, there's research on how water and conflict because of this specific thing is occurring. And what they're saying is there's research models looking at how conflict occurs from water scarcity or too much water. And they've laid it out in pretty clear detail, which is you have some sort of external water shock, which is usually flooding, but also can be drought. You have direct impacts from that flooding. So you can imagine somebody's home floods. But that results in secondary impacts, which many times are worse, which are can be as bad as somebody being displaced. They need to move because they can't live where they want to live anymore. But it can be also, you have a wet basement. Well, you need to take out work because you have a wet basement. Well, you have to spend extra money because your carpet and drywall's ruined. And it starts to really begin to build until there's a lot of people with all having that issue, which is the tinderbox, as they've described it. And it only takes another event to result in a spark and instability. And that is where you get the conflict. And so we've experienced the tinderbox before, which is unmet expectations and potentially not really delivering for residents what they need or understanding what they need. So understanding exactly how water is external water shocks or flooding result in the impacts to residents is going to be really important, and how we reach out to residents to ensure that they're having their expectations met. And the reason why this is so important is because another talk really summed up well is there's two types of truths that are developed. We really like the scientific and quantitative truth, but many times your experience and who's around you forms your truth, and that's the second type of truth, which is the truth that's formed by a community. And what does that tell us is that these personal experience and local narratives that are developed that, we say, oh, that's silly. You should just know that more rainfall is causing flooding. That doesn't matter when a whole community is flooded and they're all feeling the suffering of that, and they form their own narratives of what's happening. Agency and scientists have to be able to take the science and deliver it to the residents in a really clear, transparent way. Otherwise, the trust is eroded between the folks that are supposed to be helping and the people that need the help. And this is why that community-centered engagement really is so important to mitigate or adapt to future climate. And we, again, kind of bringing it back to Nokomis, is when folks were flooding, they developed their own truths of what was causing that flooding. It was Grays Bay Dam, it was different things, and those truths really were what they were using. And that was a result in a lack of transparency and not getting the information that people needed. And this conference was really great. They went even further of saying, how do you get information to the right people? And this was just another kind of great quantitative example of how different communities get different information in different ways. So if you have Carver County that has a specific demographic, you're going to deliver information to them very differently than to somebody that's on the University of Minnesota campus. Those two different groups are going to take information or get information in very different ways. And so tailoring the information that we are creating is really important, because a scientific report isn't all that useful to most people, but Twitter might not be either. So figuring out how to get that information can be tailored based on the different communities, and people are doing that out there. So lastly, just summarizing the outreach portion of it, was that outreach frameworks exist that describe the conflict that MCWDs experience and how we can put a framework and steps to try and mitigate that, but more importantly, give people help that they need when they need it. Grays Bay Dam will always be a source of upstream and downstream conflict. We will always have that, and it will be kind of this upstream downstream conflict. So figuring out how we can effectively communicate it is going to be really important. And that's actually a typo, but what we're doing does really align well with the national frameworks. So we've focused a lot on the scientific portion of the climate action framework to date, which is the climate model that we're developing and the climate scenario analysis. But we have presented, there's all sorts of other portions, which includes engagement, discovery, our projects and policy development, and implementing it. So all these other pieces that we're working on in tandem are really aligned well with some of the things we learned, and we're really excited to start implementing those. And so what we learned as a team was our understand, predict, our implement, measure, and adapt, and convene and plan are 3 separate projects. They're overlapping and all connected. And we're trying to figure out how we can ensure that the research and monitoring team understands what the policy planning team needs, and we're not just building a model and saying, well, we really hope we're building it in a way that's going to be helpful. No, it's bringing everybody together so we can learn how to implement this more effectively. And what we learned about the academic community from this was that they all seem to be studying their own little tool and developing tools and asking why nobody is using them, but they're only in their own little communities. And even within the conference, they say, there's researchers saying, I don't know why people aren't using the scientific tool for policy. And then in a room, one room down, another researcher says, I really wish the policy had the science to support. So they're all working in their own independent island. And I think what we can do is serve as the connection points between these little different tools, because what I went over was maybe 15 or 20 different researchers research, and they don't know that the other ones exist or that we exist. So going to this really helps us think the tools are there, we just need to have the critical thinking to bring them back to the organization. So with that, I can take any questions, but I'm sure that all of the folks that attended the meeting probably can field questions better than I can. So.
Thanks, Brian.
I am, excuse me, I'm stunned at the volume of variables. When we started out looking at our 2D world that we want, and now I see community wealth as an issue, child stunting is an issue, education level as an issue. Oh my goodness. There's almost an endless amount. How do you discriminate between, what I'll call the top tier causes and effects of flooding versus all these other factors that can jump into that? It's just I'm not asking for an answer right now. I'm just throwing that out as, wow, what a challenge. I'm glad you gave us this huge exposure, because there's way more to it than just a quick prediction of flood. Because if you do one of these compound flooding models where you've got 12 variables, say, that can amongst themselves float, and all of a sudden you get a 1 inch, that could be a lot different if these are at a different stage and you get that 1 inch. So and to your point, where you can have 3 1 inches that don't make a bit of difference because we handled it, and all of a sudden you get a 1 inch with the right conditions and you've got cars underwater.
Yeah.
Wow, this is going to be really great when you combine everything. What a great tool. Thank you.
Any questions? Did you hear anyone talking about how to take those compound flooding factors and put them into data form?
Yeah, President White, the way that they're doing it now is, there's 2 ways. You can run a model for a very long time and see if those events happen simultaneously. The other way you can do it is just based on probability. So each event has a specific probability, and so you can run and say, okay, there's 5 variables, what if we did it 1,000 times, if all the different probabilities, and stack them together each time over and over again, and say, what's the probability of the worst thing happening? What's the probability of that happening? So you can either do it kind of with a model and say, if you run it over 100 years, what's the likelihood? Or you can just say, if we do it 1,000 times, what's the likelihood? So different ways to do it, and different organizations or university researchers are kind of figuring out the best way to.
So you don't have a number to measure how much water is in the soil. You just have to know what happens if you get a successive X inches of rain.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, all right.
So you can do it. You can do it mechanistically, like you're saying, or you can say probably, what's the probability of it happening? So there's different ways you can approach the problem.
Okay, thanks. Anything else? Well, thank you very much. Well,
Yes,
that sounds like a
this
great
is-
conference.
yeah, this is very-
Dr. Maxwell.
Go ahead. You want to say?
No.
Oh, this is very exciting. Thank you for sharing all of this.
You know what,
Arun's talking right now.
I'm sorry,
Arun has the floor.
go ahead.
Do you
No,
want to?
go ahead.
Okay. All right. This is very exciting to see what to know that the approach that we're taking is similar to what others are taking, and so we're really going down the same thing. And that they also have, it seems like they're developing tools that we can use that we can use some of the models and import them and use them for us in our folks so that we can reach down to, you're talking about layering, layering down, going down layering to secondary effects on people and so on to prevent the sort of crisis that happens, that we're able to do that. So I'd be interested to know if we're going to be looking at some of that to see whether we're going to be, this is tier 2. We're talking about the tier 2 impact, and it's really interesting how the very fact that we call it tier 2, the very fact that tier 1 is 1 and tier 2 we put down as tier 2 itself implies that we're not paying attention to the people. And so how we incorporate some of this methodology to reach out to the people is something that interests me. Because it's something that I've always noticed right from the beginning has been missing here. And so I'll be interested to see how, you don't have to answer that, but I'm just saying that I'm interested in seeing how that works.
Well, I don't disagree with you. I think that, you're a big manager and a fan of context. And I think, we don't always get the nomenclature perfect. And the tier 1, tier 2, the segmentation of our important audiences, might have an implied connotation with it that we don't want and don't intend. But we're coming from a strategic context of not having any focused level of engagement with the land use community to make big decisions about the future of the landscape and impact of volume and quality of water. So a big reason for that distinction was really just trying to orient our outreach towards developing programming that they had not prioritized before. And I think we've grown into our quote tier 1 engagement in a way where we have more transparency, more trust, more engagement with all of our policymakers, our constituent cities, to the point where folks know what we're doing, they know the direction that we're going, and they're generally supportive so that we can go about our business without major disruptions and zigzagging towards our mission. Because when people are not engaged at that level and don't understand what we're doing, our lived experience has been that we can spend 6 to 12 months, veering off course. Now, ironically, we've had the exact same experience due to climate change as our residential communities have experienced the friction of groundwater flooding, this compound flooding, and reached out looking for an understanding of, they felt the trauma of it, like Brian said. They've had to take time off work, they've had to incur additional costs with their sanitary replacement, talk to a contractor. They've had to spend time engaging with the city over and over and over again, trying to get service, understanding why it's happened. And after doing that for 2 years, you're pretty tired. After doing it for 6, you're completely exhausted. And that was the powder keg that we saw, where people were really reaching out to the DNR commissioner, the head of Board of Water and Soil Resources, all of their legislators, the city council. And then eventually that did become our problem. That was a long fuse. It was 6 years of slow burn before it really affected us. And I think one of the things that we're really bringing back from this conference is we've experienced that, and we understand what it took to engage the community at that point, not having done it proactively leading up to it. And we've talked about it, there's a lot of coordination costs that involved multiple rounds of 6-figure investments from the county, from the DNR and groundwater wells, 2.5 years of staff time, big town hall, political engagement for a year and a half that Charity lived through, all to get the information to people in a way that they were able to actually consume it and understand what was happening and come to terms with where they were going to get service from. So I think this is, there's a lot here, and how, where am I going with this? Page 1 of our principles document that we developed recently in the last year, page 1 talks about there's always going to be an upstream-downstream dynamic.
Yes.
And Grays Bay will always be the center of conversation.
Yes.
And our climate action framework says that as flood risk potential increases, constituents are going to become more and more politically engaged. That was a message I delivered to the Minneapolis Steering Committee, if you remember, at the meeting. And so knowing that, it really starts to guide and inform what is the long-term sustained dissemination of information, engagement, communications, outreach. What are the channels and what's the information that we need to get out, and who do we need to get it to in real time over a long period of time, ahead of there being problems.
Yes.
So that there's a baked-in understanding of the upstream, downstream dynamics, so that when there is chronic flooding, that understanding is there and you're not trying to unwind it. And it really is a factor of working at, and we've talked about this, all levels of government and kind of all levels of people. And one of the things that was fascinating that Brian teased out from the conference is how these community truths are formed. And when a whole bunch of people are impacted, there's usually 2 to 5 to 8 that really lean in and raise their hand and become leaders in the community. And they go to all the public hearings, they consume all the information from the park board's website, and they form their understanding of what's happening. And that is the source of information then for the rest of the community.
Yes.
And our experience has been they're doing their best, but they don't always get it right. And so, engaging reactively on the back end, we know just from practice and experience, no matter who you're talking to, is the wrong time to be doing it.
Yep.
So I think when we think about tier 2 engagement, there is residential and community engagement at a capital project level. If we're going to be going into a community and the science is telling us a project needs to be there, we're already, I think, fairly well equipped to understand community demographics, who the community leaders are. We've done it with 325. And go to people and put the information in their hands. But when you're thinking about a systemic issue, like climate and how it's going to impact these downstream, upstream perspectives, I think it argues for a long-term concentrated focus for how we engage the communities downstream that are always going to be on the receiving end of increased precipitation and how it's going to be impacting them. So, really, really long-winded answer, but it will be a both-and approach. And it really is about, I think, avoiding those situations in the future, because they'll just be cyclical. We have to learn from our past and draw these lessons and figure out how people in those communities are consuming information, what information channels are going to be receptive to, what packaging information is most useful. I think what we found is the technical studies aren't in. They'll read them and take out the pieces that they understand and it's twisted. And we got 2 people in town hall in a simple format and you're meeting people face to face. There was a long line of people afterwards thanking us for how clear everything was. So I don't know that I'm answering your question directly, but yeah, I think I'm picking up what you're laying down, and we can certainly rebrand our audience segments. Maybe it's column A and column B, or policymakers, staff, and residents, and just call them directly what they are. But yeah.
To your point, James, for the last 6 years, we've been sending out updates to the people affected with the status of the dam with upcoming weather. And we have had so much positive feedback from the people, from our constituents, from the folks along the creek. I mean, that's one thing, and we've become very good at communicating one thing, and we've gotten great positive feedback. So it's kind of like with 100 different variables now that'll come into this, it's a model on how we can do it right. And I think we, with that same amount of effort, can continue to increase the way we communicate and keep people from being disappointed.
There's an extrapolation from there for sure, but I think the audience that are getting those communications around Grays Bay Dam operation and flood risk potential and what it means are municipal officials, their emergency response managers, and their public works staff. They are used to consuming technical information from other agencies via email. So they're primed to find value in that, and that's why we get the response. The general public don't want a really wordy email about a flood forecast. And in fact, there's, it's a different bar of entry. They need to understand how a watershed works and what is upstream and what the difference is between, a 1-inch rainfall event when the sponge is saturated produces a 2.5-foot peak versus when it's dry. There's some basic kind of core concepts that are limiting, those are the bar of entry for getting people to understand the upstream, downstream dynamic. And so it's about what channels are people going to consume information, and then what information and data-driven sound bites are really going to resonate. And everybody's going to be approaching the problem from a different vantage point and a different level of experience and perspective. I think this is a slight shifting gears away from some of the outreach stuff, but obviously on the same thread. Brian had hit on the exposure, and the flood model will give us an understanding of what the flood risk is. How high the water is going to be during a variety of different future forecasts. But the vulnerability of infrastructure and people, that's the layering in. The infrastructure and the people aren't necessarily causing the flooding, but when you get to the next step of, well, where are the vulnerabilities? The age of the infrastructure, the size of the infrastructure, the location of the infrastructure, or who lives in the community, what's their socioeconomic status, those sorts of things. And then resilience gets tossed around a lot as a word, and we even use it. And one of the things that I brought back from the conference as a learning, and it's not revelatory, but it's a paradigm, is the resilience in a community is the community's ability to bounce back when it does flood. Not, adaptation is how do we lower flood risk potential. But resilience is how quickly can we bounce back, and that means how quickly can infrastructure bounce back. If it's designed to accommodate and relieve floodwaters, it's more resilient. That's good. The road or the golf course is under flood conditions for a shorter duration, and you can get the tee boxes and the greens up and running if we're talking about Hiawatha. And then the resilience of the people really is driven by, do they understand it's going to flood? Do they understand the conditions that drive flooding? Do they know where to get sandbags? They have resources to actually respond to flooding? Are they asleep? And that was one of the things that they've done studies, it's not rocket science, but the resilience of a pocket of community to extreme flooding on the coast is dependent on whether or not people are awake and working and have executive function, or they're checked out for the night and asleep, because government's wound down, the communication channels are different, and so if that community is impacted by flooding, it takes it an extra week perhaps to actually respond post-flood. Well, that drives how you start to think about your operations in a flood response plan. And what resilience means getting information to people way ahead of floodings, so they understand what their role is in responding as a resident and where they should go for resources, which is something that Manager Loftus has pointed out with our flood response plan, is we're not responsible for emergency response and sandbags and everything else, but people knowing what their job is, even at a residential level, and how they can go, where they can go, and how they can access resources. If they know, it's like if a fire happens in your house, if you have a plan and you're drilled, you're more resilient, you're going to respond quicker. So I think we've been really focused on a tool to understand exposure, which is flood risk, but the vulnerability is going to be differential across communities based on the age of infrastructure, where it's located, and who's there. And similarly, how resilient those pockets of communities are will impact how quickly they can bounce back. It's not about eliminating flooding. It's about improving your ability to adapt, but when it does flood, how quickly can everybody in the community, businesses, residents, and infrastructure get back up and running? And that will influence to some level where we prioritize our investments, because you could have a relatively high flood risk, but if the resilience is really high, you probably want to be working in an area where the resilience is lower. You could be working in an area where the resilience is lower and the flood risk is more moderate. So I think exposure from the 2D model will be a first layer, and then we'll be layering in these other pieces to inform where do you make investments, what information do we need to get to who, so that we can increase resilience on the back end. And I think the other thing is we put a lot of weight behind the model, and rightfully so. The other thing we took away from the science is there's a million different ways to understand exposure, vulnerability, and resilience. FEMA has given very simple mathematical guidance for understanding flood risk if you don't have access to someone like Brian or the legislative funds in the model. Add 2% to the 500-year event and map that. There's geospatial guidance and tools for understanding community vulnerability based on federal data sets that are already there. And so the team's starting to think about how do we look at this problem from 360 degrees so that we're not, the model is not going to be definitive. That's not going to be a perfect picture of the future. And so taking all these different ways to look at exposure, vulnerability, and resilience was, I think, another big thing that I took away. We don't just want to use one analytical tool and confine ourselves to that reality. We want to triangulate on what the future might look like using a variety of different analytical methods, and that will help us communicate to people too. We don't want to just have one data set that we're pushing out as a perfect picture of the future. So, a few ramblings.
Thank you. Did you still have a question, Mr.
Yeah, or comment. I think time is at an essence on this storage. Morningside is a great example. When that land was vacant, half of the land was in Edina and the other half was St. Louis Park. It came up that St. Louis Park wanted to keep it for maybe possible homes and so forth. Edina wanted to keep it as a park and in a future storage. Well, we've got a future storage, and I think people can understand if you can store the water temporarily and then let it out slowly, you're going to avoid a lot of the flooding. So, and they can understand that. So, I think we have to educate the people with this data and then the storage. We're pouring all this concrete all over our cities and states and so forth, and that water rushes off rapidly. So, I think Morningside is another good example of we did the right thing. So, and then when the time comes, we can show the people how important wetlands are to store this excess water during, flooding events. So that's I think that's part of the education, and that's a part of the education that people actually can see rather than all the statistics we give them. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Anything else? Good. Report.
Thank you so
I'm glad
much.
guys went.
I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank
Great.
you. It's a lot, isn't it? Mr. Whisker, Administrator's Report.
Okay. I
Do you
just
have one of these?
No, but I can.
You really should.
Yep. At some point, if the board's comfortable, we could contemplate reintegrating me up at the dais. So, and then I'll have a fixed mic. I only have one very simple kind of operational administrator's report today, and it's related to Stantec's business with us and business with communities. Occasionally, they represent a municipality or were already representing a municipality before they acquired WENC, and that poses a potential conflict of interest, and I've gotten into the habit of disclosing those. So Stantec did serve one of our smaller communities in Lake Minnetonka Beach, before they acquired WENC. And Minnetonka Beach, I understand, is developing a drinking water treatment facility or updating. And as part of that, they're more than likely going to be required to develop some sort of stormwater BMP to treat the runoff associated with it, and they'll need a permit from us. And so Chris raised that, like he always does for my knowledge, as a potential conflict. And as you know, in our contract, I have the ability to waive those, but I usually let you know to see if there's any concerns. I would plan to do that in this instance. It seems very small, nominal risk. And Stantec also is large enough and capable enough that they develop very strong management firewalls between the folks that are working on the municipal front and then Chris's water resource group. So otherwise, I don't have any updates. So just some potential conflict, but not anticipated, I guess.
All right. Thank you. Meeting is adjourned.